Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin Yud Bet. Today's daf is sponsored by Aviram and Miki Kadosh in honor of their son Yonatan's wedding to Yotav. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with a quick review of yesterday's daf. There's a study guide which will also help organize a bit of a complicated daf. 2 days of Shabbat Chag, a little hard to get back into it, but we will do our best. So, starting with the Mishna on Yud Aleph, we saw on Yud Aleph Amud Bet. If somebody says, give this get to my wife, give this emancipation document to my slave, according to Rabbi Meir, they don't acquire it for them yet. Why not? Because for both of them, it's a chov. It's not necessarily a good thing to get, again, the not necessarily is the important word. It might be good. Woman might want her divorce. The Eved might want his freedom, but it's not clear because there's also things that they lose out on. According to the rabbis, wait a minute, what are you talking about? The Eved is actually only good because if you say the main thing we're assuming is, what's the issue? The issue is the husband provides food for the slave. The husband provides food for the wife. As soon as they're divorced, as soon as the slave is freed, the husband no longer needs to do that. Well, come the rabbis and they say, but if somebody wanted, and that's going to be the main topic for today, if somebody wanted to make their slave take care of their own sustenance, they could, even when they're still a slave, which means that the emancipation is only good because he's not losing out on any food, okay? Because he could have lost out on the food. The master could have cut him off from food even when he was still his slave, which is a difficult concept, and we're going to talk about it. That's what we're going to get to today. To which Rabbi Meir said, what do you mean? The Eved, while he's still living in the master's house, if he works for a Kohen, he can eat truma. So now that he's freed, he can't eat truma. That's a loss for him. And therefore, that's why Rabbi Meir still says, I think it's a loss for him. And again, how does it work? If it's a loss, then when the husband gives it to a shaliach and says, go give this, it's not a done deal until it actually gets to the woman or the slave. Whereas if you say it's only good for the person, which is what the rabbis were trying to say, it's only good for the slave, then actually, as soon as he says, give this to my slave, it's as if it's an already done deal. And he can never change his mind about it because the messenger actually acquires it for him. From there, we got into this whole discussion, the Gemara, about Tofes L'Bal Chov Kana. If I owe you money, if you owe me money, and someone else comes and takes the money for me, can they do that? Can they do it even in a case where there's other people you owe money to, and by them grabbing it for me, it will make you lose out, right? You listen to the Shiur, we brought the parking spot example, right? That if somebody, it's always, right, bothers us when somebody stands in a parking spot and saves it for somebody else, because that's not fair. It's a free-for-all, right? Whoever gets there first gets there first. It's true they got there first technically, but they're standing, they're not in a car, they're not anything, right? So that would be similar, I think, and we'll come back to this example in another 2 minutes, to Hatofes l'Bal Chov b'mkom shechav l'acheirim. Again, it's not exactly about Chov, it's more like from the Hefker. But the example they bring to compare these two machlokot is to say, Rav Chisda then says, the issue of Tofes l'Bal Chov, whether you can do it if it's causing a loss to other people, seems to be the same machloket as we see by Pe'ah. You leave over a corner of your field, and then someone goes to collect it for a different poor person. Okay, let's say, I'm not poor. I go and I collect it for my friend who's poor. Am I allowed to do that? Because I'm actually causing a loss to all the other poor people who could have collected it. So there's a machloket about it in the Mishna, in Pe'ah, about whether you're allowed to do this or not. So whether I can take it and give it to you, or let's say you're the poor person, or can I take it and once I take it, I have to give it to the first poor person that shows up there. So now they try to suggest it's the exact same machloket. It's basically taking something, right? And the truth is the poor person is a more similar example to the parking spot because there it's what we call ownerless, right? As opposed to, in the first case, someone was owed money. This is just ownerless. And can I take it when it's actually then not going to go to the person who shows up next? So now we're going to start from the very bottom of Yud Aleph Amud Bet. Amar Amemar v'itema Rav Papa. One of them said this. Dilmalohi. I don't think the comparison is a fair comparison to the poor person case in the Pe'ah, the corner of the field. Because Ad kan lo ka'amar Rabbi Eliezer hatam, in the case where I go into the person's field, they left the corner for the poor person. I'm not a poor person, but I can take it for a poor person. Why does this work? It works for a different reason. It doesn't work because I'm like Tofes Labal Chobin Kom Shchav Lachirim. I could just take something even if someone else is owed. But because of what? Because I can theoretically make myself a poor person. How can I do that? I can do it instantaneously. Okay? If you ever wondered, you can become poor in a second. How can I become poor in a second? I can say all my property is ownerless. I can be mafkir it. I could say, and then 10 minutes later, I can go and say, oh, I'm buying it all back. I'm acquiring it all. So if I can do that momentarily, obviously it's a little dangerous. Someone might, in the meantime, come and take your property. Hope is, that won't happen. But since theoretically, okay, here comes the theoretical. Migo is always from mito, from the fact that I can theoretically do this. Since I could theoretically turn myself into a poor person, then if I'm poor, I can actually take it. Now, if I could take it for myself and I could give it to you as a gift. So therefore, I could choose, once I take it and it's mine, I could choose whoever I want to give it to. Now, it's not actually mine because I'm not actually poor, but I could be poor at that moment if I wanted to. Therefore, migo de zache lenafshe, since theoretically I could take it for myself, zache lechavre, I could then take it for someone else. Aval hachalo, but that's not the same. If you owe me money and someone comes to take the money from you, when they're a random person and they go and just grab your money and say, oh, I'm giving this to Michelle because I know she's owed money. But, Jane is also owed money. And by you taking the money from the person who, okay, let's give some names, but by Jill going to take the money from you, that Jane is also owed, they're making Jane lose out, right? Jill basically, who takes the money from you, has no rights to that money whatsoever. That's not the same as taking it from a poor person, from the poor person's money, the poor person's payah, because anyone theoretically can make themselves poor in a second. Okay, that's the difference. I want to compare it to the parking lot example, the parking spot. With a parking spot, what bothers you when someone takes a parking spot? When they're standing on the street and they stand in the parking spot. At least this bothers me, right? Why? Because a person standing on the street is not relevant to take a parking spot, right? Parking spots are not meant for people standing on the street. Just like money owed to me is not money owed to you, right? You have no rights to that money. But let's say someone came by and parked in a parking spot to save for somebody else. So they parked, sat there for 5 minutes till their friend showed up. Their friend shows up, they pull out, right? I mean, the most realistic example is I'm leaving somewhere and I know someone's coming. So I wait in my car for 5 minutes till they show up. Now, if I saw that kind of thing happen, I wouldn't be so annoyed because, right? If let's say I was saving it for you. So I'm sitting in the parking spot. I can sit in the parking spot as long as I want, right? Once I get the parking spot, it's mine and I'm in a car. So it makes sense in that case because I can actually have the parking spot because I have a car. So it's meant for me. So the fact that I'm saving it for you is not such a big deal. But when it's not meant for me because I'm standing on the street, that's a totally different story. So in that sense, we could understand this distinction between the poor person and the person who is owed money from someone. So now we're going to say also on the flip side, that was all Rabbi Eliezer. We're going to say Rabbi Eliezer might say when it comes to the poor person that since I can theoretically take the money because I could theoretically be poor, it makes sense. But when it comes to I'm owed money, well, you can't go take the money for me when I'm owed money. Likewise, in the reverse, when it comes to the poor person, the rabbis say you can't take it. No way, no how. But they might say in terms of this creditor that, you could take it from me, the creditor. Why? Because there's a special drasha by the collection of the pe'ah, of the corner of the field. Dichtiv, lo tilaket la'ani. Now you have to read the pasuk to understand what's going on. It's in Vayikra chapter 23, verse 22. When you're cutting everything in the fields, lo techale pe'atzatcha b'kurtzacha v'leke kitzercha lo tilaket. Okay, Don't collect the pe'ah and the leket, except it's left behind. La'ani v'lager ta'azov otam. Okay, leave it for the poor people. Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am Hashem your God, and I'm telling you to do this. Now, the drasha is lo tilaket la'ani. Now, in between the words lo tilaket and la'ani, there's a break. Okay, again, I'm going to read it again. Don't lo techale pe'atzadcha b'kurtzrecha v'leket kitzircha lo tilaket. Don't collect the leket, don't take the pe'ah. La'ani v'lager ta'azov otam. Right, leave it for the poor person. But the fact that the word lo tilaket is right next to la'ani, we're going to read it as if it's together. Lo tilaket la'ani. Don't collect for a poor person. So he darshans it as you're not allowed to collect for the poor person. And then that's the rabbis. But it's a special drasha only for poor people. But if it comes to I'm owed money by you, someone could go take it and get it from me, no problem, even if there's other people owed money, because there's no special drasha telling me no. Now they're going to ask Rabbi Eliezer, what does Rabbi Eliezer do with that drasha? Now you could just say simply, he reads the pasuk the normal way and doesn't think that it's meant to be darshan. But they come up with an answer for him also. When it says lo tilaket la'ani, that means if you're a poor person, if you are a poor person who owns a field, it might be a very small field, you might not have a lot of produce, you still have to leave the corner over, you still have to leave the leket, right? Things that were left behind that didn't get collected. You have to leave them for the poor people, even if you yourself are poor, and even if you yourself can go collect in someone else's field, but your field you have to leave for other people. So that's a different drasha that he gets from there, which is why he doesn't get this drasha of the rabbis. What we basically did so far today was to say that the suggestion we saw at the end of yesterday's daf that the machloka by the poor person is the same as tofes l'ba'al chov is not true. It's not the same. Now we're going to spend most of our day, and this is the complicated part of today's daf, on this next topic. Right? What did the Mishna say? If you want to not feed your eved, you can, in which case come the rabbis and they say it's clearly a zchut for the eved. It's only good for the eved to be freed, because you could say, well, he's getting food from you, but he doesn't necessarily have to, because you could theoretically not feed him. Now, this is morally challenging, right? And I believe that the Gemara and the whole agenda of the Gemara here is trying to deal with this moral dilemma, because the Gemara says, Shmat mina, you can infer from here, Yachol harav lamar la'eved, asei imi ve'eni zancha. It sounds like the owner can say to the slave, work for me, I'm going to take all the proceeds of what you do, ve'eni zancha, and I am not going to support you. You'll figure out your own food situation. Okay, that's what it sounds like from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah basically seems to say, if he wanted to, he could not sustain him. And obviously, we're assuming it means the Adon is going to get all the proceeds, and the slave will be left alone to deal with somehow find food. I don't know how, right? And that's very difficult to think that you could do such a thing. If you might remember, we learned in Ketubot that with a woman, all the woman's maaseh yadeha, everything she makes, goes to the husband. And in return, the husband sustains her. He gives her food. If he wants, they can, or if they want, they can make an arrangement, which is called si maaseh yadayach bimzonotayach, which he could say to her, or she could say to him, you know, I want to keep the proceeds of what I make, and I'll sustain myself. In other words, it's tit for tat, really. It's one for one. If she keeps the maaseh yadayim, then she supports herself. If he gets them, then he has to support her. That's the way it works with a woman. And from the fact that the Mishnah is saying there's a difference between a woman and a slave, from there it seems like the slave doesn't have to be that way. The slave, you could say, I get all your proceeds, and your food, well, you'll have to fend for yourself. And that's why getting his freedom is a huge thing, and it's obviously a zchut, because at that point, he's in charge of his own food. Now, it's not to say every master does this. It's just to say, theoretically, if they wanted to, they could have, which is why getting his freedom is only good. Okay? Now, again, the truma issue aside, which Rabbi Meir disagrees about. We'll get back to that later. But according to the rabbis, this sounds like it's it. What the Gemara is going to do right now is they're going to, starting with our Mishnah, that's source number one, we're going to have 5 sources from which the Gemara is going to say the simple reading of these 5 sources, although the third one's going to be a little different. But the simple reading is that the Adon, the master, can say to the slave, Asei mi ve'eni zancha. You work for me, I get all the proceeds, and I don't have to feed you. And the immediate reaction in all the sources is to try to say, no, that's not true. Okay? Only you'll see at the very end, maybe I shouldn't give it away, but very final source, they're actually going to succeed in proving that really this is true. The master can actually say to the Eved, the slave, you work for me, I get all the proceeds, and you have to fend for yourself. But until the last source, the Gemara is going to try very, very hard to read every other source and say, not the case. Okay? It's going to be, because they have such an agenda, it's going to be a little tricky, okay? And this is why the sugya is a little challenging, because they're going to have to reread and then question, and could it really be? And there's a lot of ins and outs here. That's the main structure of today. So let's start. So the first is our Mishna. Okay, the first three are Tanaitic sources. The next two are Emoraim, who speak. Shmat Nina. So again, from the simple reading of the Mishnah, it sounds like you can say, Yachol Rav Lomar LaEved, the Rav is the master. Sometimes he's called an Adon, sometimes a Rav. It doesn't mean a rabbi. Can say to the Eved, the slave, Aseini ve'eni zancha. You work for me, I get all your proceeds, and I don't have to feed you. And that's why, again, when he gets his freedom, it's a huge thing. And they say, no, it's the Amalei Tzema Seyadecha Limzonotecha. No, our Mishnah is talking about a case where he says, you work, you keep your proceeds, and you support yourself. Now, they say, wait a minute, but that doesn't make any sense. Because what did we do in the Mishnah? We compared the slave to the woman. And we said for the slave, the husband doesn't have to feed the slave. For the woman, the husband does have to feed the woman. So now, if we're going to say it's a case of that he doesn't have to sustain the Eved because he can tell the Eved, work, keep your own proceeds, well, then it would be the same for the woman. The woman also, he can say that to the woman. And then we're trying, in the Mishnah, they made this distinction, slave and woman. So how could we say this? So they say, but the woman, you're allowed to do this also. And again, the Mishnah set up a distinction. You can say this to the slave, you can't say it to the woman. So if we're saying what you could say to the slave is, take what you make and use it to sustain yourself. But the woman, you could say the same thing. And the Mishnah said it's not the same. So you can't, it doesn't really work. To which they say no, because Isha b'delo saf. The woman, when it says you can't do that for the woman, you can't do it for the woman in a case where she's not able to make enough money to sustain herself. But let's assume the average salary is $500 a week. Okay. That's what someone needs to work on. If the woman can't make $500 a week, then you can't do this. So when the Mishnah says you can't do it, it was talking about for a woman where the woman can't sustain herself with that amount of money. She can't make enough. So to which they say, but again, if you're comparing the slave to the woman, then it should be the exact same case. So Rabbanit Michelle Farber, but then you should say the same thing for the slave. Now again, if you have to sustain your slave, and the only way you don't have to sustain your slave is if you say, take your proceeds and spend your, use it to support yourself, then also it wouldn't be enough if the slave can't make enough money, right? If the woman can't make enough money, you have to support her. The slave can't make enough money, you have to support him also. And then again, we're trying to find a difference between the two, and that would be the same. To which they answer, no one in their right mind would keep a slave who can't make enough money to feed himself. Because again, if you're supposed to support this slave, then, and the slave, right, the slave is working for you. Why are they working for you? The slave is working for you so that you can have money, right? If the slave makes only $300 a week and it costs $500 to feed him, you would never keep the slave. Now, when you have a wife, you're not looking at the wife. The husband doesn't look at the wife as a way of making money. It's not a money-making thing. So the wife, you could see a case where she wouldn't make enough money, and that's why the husband has to support her if she can't make enough money. But this Canaanite slave, no one would keep a Canaanite slave if they couldn't make more than what they eat. So basically, we've resolved the Mishnah. It's not a simple reading of the Mishnah, but in order to grapple with this difficult ethical problem, again, I believe that's what the sugya is saying. It doesn't say that, but I assume the Gemara is grappling with, how could you possibly say to your slave, I don't want to feed you, which is the simple reading of the Mishnah. It must be a case where you said, keep your proceeds to yourself and support yourself. And that's what it means. It's better for the slave to be free because, then he's totally on his own, as opposed to, it's not like the master is really supporting him at this point. Okay. So since he doesn't have to support him by getting his freedom, what's the addition? If he's taking his proceeds and he's using it for his food, what's the difference to be free? Well, he's just a free man, right? In other words, it's better for him to be free and he's not losing anything, okay? Because the husband didn't have to support him before, he doesn't have to support him now, and therefore all he's gaining is freedom, which is good. He's not losing out on any rights by being free. Tashma, second source. This is very interesting. You might never have thought of this, but just like if I kill someone accidentally, I would go to a refuge city. An Eved Knani, who again is in the pseudo status, they have certain, right? They're basically part of Jewish law other than time-bound mitzvah. So going to Ir Miklat is not a time-bound mitzvah. If he murders someone accidentally, he also goes to Ir Miklat. Okay, now what happens when he goes to Ir Miklat? He's no longer living in the proximity of the master, but he's still owned by him. So here the Tosefta tells us, Ein rabo chayav lezono. Okay, you no longer have to sustain your slave. V'lo od ela, and not only that, but shemase yadav lerabo. Number one, you don't have to sustain your slave. Number two, you get his proceeds. So this sounds very clearly, what we were trying to say isn't really the case, right? But shma mina, from here you can infer what? Yachol harav lomar la'eved asemi b'mizamcha. Again, the structure is going to be the same. We have this source. It seems to imply something that, really? Does this really mean that you can take all the proceeds and not give him food? To which the Gemara says, no, it's not true. That's not the way to understand this Tosefta. So again, they're going to say, it's a case where you said, keep your maseh yadayim, which obviously doesn't make any sense because it says the Adon keeps the maseh yadayim. So we're going to have to explain that in a minute. But you take whatever you make and use it to support yourself. So so why does it say in the Tosefta that whatever you make goes to the master? That's not what you just said. You just said it's when they made this deal and the master said, listen, I don't want to have to support you. So you take your proceeds and, whatever you make, use it to support yourself. So how do they explain the Tosefta then? Laha'adafa. We said it costs $500 a week to survive. So let's say the slave makes $700 a week. So what is the Tosefta telling you? The master can say, listen, keep your proceeds, use it to support yourself. That's $500. But the extra $200 that you make, that goes l'rabo. That goes back to the master. To which the Gemara says, hadafa pshita. Obviously, the extra money goes to the master. Why? Because masha kanav do kanarabo. Anything the slave makes goes to his master. So even if the master said to him, keep your proceeds for yourself, what he obviously meant was the $500 to support your food bills for the week. But beyond that, obviously it goes to the master. You don't need a special Tosefta, a special source to tell us that. To which they answer, Ma'u detema. You might have thought, if he only made $500, the master would get nothing. That's clear because he needs the $500 to survive for. Ki eat leinami lo lishkomine. Maybe when he does make extra, maybe the master, the thought is that maybe once you make this deal, use your own proceeds for your food, that maybe when there's extra, maybe it wouldn't go to him. Hamash Malan, that's why they have to tell you the extra goes to the master. So again, looking back at the source says, the Rav can say to the Eved, the source says, Eved Shagalali Ir Miklat. Number one, he doesn't have to support him. Number two, he gets the proceeds. The master is in a case, again, where they made this deal and he said, you keep your proceeds for yourself, use it to pay your food bills. And then there was some extra and the extra goes back to the master. That's what it's telling you. That all sounds fine and good. However, it's going to have to fit with the rest of the Tosefta. So we're now going to slowly unravel what the rest of that Tosefta says and try to figure out, we're going to have sentence number 2 and then sentence number 3. So first sentence number 2, we're going to try to reconcile that with sentence number 1. We're going to assume if it's describing a bit of a different case, it's still the same parameters. So we're going to see if that works. And there's charts on the page that go through the different sections here. So first they answer, actually, before they even do that, there's one more question, which is, Mishna l'arei miklat. Why is arei miklat any different? In other words, this is a basic law. If a master tells his slave, keep your proceeds, right, and use it to survive, use it to live. So basically what happens is exactly this. He uses the first $500 to pay for his food bills. After that, anything additional goes to the master. So Mishna l'arei miklat. Why is this specifically talking about someone who goes to a refuge city? What's the difference if the slave is in the refuge city or the slave is living in the house of the master? So they answer, there's a special pasuk by Ir Miklat, which says v'chai. Okay, it says you should run to one of these cities and live. And they learn from the word v'chai, avid lechiyut hatfei. Maybe you get to live. Maybe we want to overcompensate for the fact that you got yourself into this bad situation. You're living in an Ir Miklat and you accidentally murdered someone, and we want to have sympathy for you. So v'chai, so they learn all sorts of things that people have to support them in the city and all that. Maybe avid lechiyut hatfei. Maybe he gets extra. Maybe the ha'adafa in this case, if he's living in your house and you say, take your proceeds and support yourself, of course, everything extra is going to go to you. But if he's living in a Ir Miklat, maybe we give him extra money, extra spending money, because it's a tough life there. Hamash malan, it's coming to teach you, no, even in an Ir Miklat, you don't get it. Okay, you'll get your $500, but you're not going to get up to the extra $200. So now we're going to go to what I said before. I jumped the gun a little, but let's look at the next line. The next line says, Aval, but as opposed to this case, which was a slave, we're again going to compare it to a woman. Isha shegalta la'arei miklat, if a woman goes to an Ir Miklat, ba'ala chayav b'mzonoteha, he must pay for her food. Okay, so a slave, you don't have to. It's very similar to our Mishna. A woman, you do have to. Now, michlal, from here you can infer, if he has to pay her food, then what? It can't be a case where he said to her, keep your proceeds and support yourself, because if that were the case, she would have to support herself, right? So michlal de lo amarla, di amarla, if he had said to her, like we assume that Eved, we're taught in order to avoid saying you really don't have to support your slave at all and you can keep all his proceeds, we had to explain that it was a case where you made this deal. You keep your proceeds and use it to support yourself, right? I won't take your proceeds. And if we say this the same thing for the woman, well, then he actually doesn't need to support her. But what are we going to answer? Right? First, they're going to say, we're going to assume these are they're comparable cases. It's just one is the woman, one is the slave. So the difference is not what the details were. It must be if in the woman case, he didn't say, make this deal with her, keep your proceeds and use it to support yourself. It must be with the slave also. So again, what's the case then? He doesn't make any deal with them. He keeps the masei yadayim of the woman. He keeps the masei yadayim of the slave. And with the slave, he could say, go support yourself. And with the woman, he can't. And that's the way we're understanding it now, in which case we're back to square one, which is you really can say that terrible thing, which go deal with it yourself. I'm going to keep all your money and you figure out how to live. So the answer, no. La'olam da'amalei. Both cases are where he's made this deal. You keep your proceeds, use it to support yourself. What was the problem with the woman? We already know from the previous. Isha b'delo safka, but she can't afford to pay her bills. She only makes $300. And that's why he has to give her the extra $200. Okay, so now we've assumed it is se masei yadecha and si masei yadayich. Both cases are where they made this deal. And then it avoids us having to go to that place of saying where he doesn't have to support him at all. And he doesn't, he could keep all his proceeds, the master could keep all the proceeds. But line number 3 is going to create a problem. Because if we say line number 1 and line number 2, the slave, the woman are all in a case where he made this deal. So, what does the last line say? Like I said, we're going to slowly unravel all the lines of this Tosefta. Line number 2 says, if he says, right, the husband has to sustain his wife. Line number 3 says, but if he says to her, keep your proceeds and with that support yourself, then he can, meaning he doesn't have to support her. So now you tell me, right? Michal Deresha, from the fact that line 3 says, it says it explicitly. It's a case where he says to her, keep your proceeds to support yourself. which makes it sound like, since we didn't mention that until this point in the Tosefta, Michal Deresha de lo Amrala. It sounds like line 2 is not that, in which case line 1 would not be that, in which case we're back to square one. That it's not a case where he told him he doesn't have to support him because he said, keep your proceeds and with that support yourself. No, it's not that case. To which they come up with an answer. Again, a little of a stretch, but hachikama. Now, remember what we said. With the slave, he said, keep your proceeds and I'm not going to feed you. And he actually can. And if the slave makes more money, those proceeds go to the husband. The woman, it was a case where she didn't make enough money. And that's why he said, take your money, support yourself. And if she doesn't make enough money, he has to pay her money. The third line is coming to say, same thing. He did make this deal, but she is able to make enough money. Im maspeket, if she can make enough money to support herself, and he said to her, Rashai, then he can. So basically, it's not a difference in the case in terms of what he made a deal. All 3 cases, he made this deal. You keep your proceeds, support yourself with the proceeds. The difference between line 2 and line 3 is there's a woman who made only $300 and there's a woman who made $500. So when she makes the $500 that she needs to support herself, he can let her and doesn't have to support her at all. But when she can't afford to live on what she makes, then he has to. Again, it's not the pshat reading of this source because the tzima seyadayich only comes up in the Tosefta at the last case. But again, because they're motivated to not get into this place where we say you can just ignore your slave, take all his proceeds and leave him on the street, right? We'd rather explain it in this manner. But then they still have another question. They say, if she can afford to feed herself, why are you telling us this? We know if she can afford to sustain herself based on her salary, of course he doesn't have to feed her. This isn't just uniquely in this case. So they say, well, it is uniquely in this case that they want to teach you this. Why? You might have thought that since she's living in a strange city now, a woman can work in her own town, but maybe it's not appropriate for her to work in a town that's new. Maybe it's not, again, how exactly to define kol kvuda b'melech pnima, but a woman's better off being in the house. And particularly when she's in a strange city where people aren't familiar with her, maybe it'll attract attention to her. Maybe it won't be the right thing to do. So you might have thought, maybe he can't make this deal with her that he normally, under normal circumstances, can. But when she goes to the refuge city, maybe he fully has to support her and can't say to her, go work, make your own money and be self-sufficient. Maybe he can't say that to her. And the answer is he can. Okay, so that was a way of dealing with that second source so that we don't get stuck into that position. Third source, Lema Kitanai. Now they want to suggest that maybe it's a machloket between Tanaim about whether you can say, Asayimi ve'eni zamcha, sorry, I'm keeping all your proceeds, you're not working, right? But you have to find your own salary or not. How so? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, Yachol ha'eved lomar lerabo b'shnei batzoret. Okay, each case is a little unique, right? Now we're in a drought. There's a drought, there's no food around, right? Prices are very high. So the slave can say, listen, he can give an ultimatum to the owner and say, either support me, and if you can't, free me. And the rabbis say, no. The master can say, tough luck. I know I can't support you right now, but you still have to work for me. So what does this sound like? Right? So the rabbis say, he can say, tough luck on you, right? You work for me and I don't have to support you. And the first opinion that said he gave the slave can give him an ultimatum, Savari no yachol, says you can't. To which the Gemara rejects this and says, but Tizbra, do you really think so? If so, the language doesn't make sense. If you wanted to say that, it should have said it explicitly. Instead of saying, either feed me or free me, it should have been, it's not that he has to be freed. He says, either free me, either support me, or let me keep my own proceeds and then, I'll support myself with it. Ve'od, and furthermore, this isn't only true in a drought. This would be true in any case. So, it must be, instead of saying it's a Tanitic debate, which would then again find us a source that you could do this kind of thing and leave your slave on the street, keep his proceeds and say, tough luck to you. Well, no, we're going to say here, it's a case, he already told him keep your proceeds, use it to support yourself. But because it was a shnei batzoret, it was a drought, it just wasn't enough for him. Rashbag savar, so now here comes the machlok. What's the machloket? Then it's a totally different topic, not our topic. Rashbag says, you can say, oh, parnaseni, either support me or set me free. Why do I have to be set free if you won't support me? Because people will see me if I am free, then I'm a regular Jew. Remember, a Canaanite slave becomes a Jew. Then people will see me as a part of the Jewish community and they'll have rachamim on me. If I'm your slave, number one, I'm not even Jewish and people might not have as much sympathy for me. And number two, I'm your slave. People think you're you're responsible for me and you're not taking care of me. So free me so that people will see me and they'll realize that they have to help me. Because this guy can only make $300, he needs $500 to live on. Or, maybe he can make $500, but now the prices went up to $700 a week because we're in a drought. But Rabbanan Savre, what do you mean? What are you talking about? People have rachamim also on Canaanite slaves. If people are going to be sympathetic, they'll be sympathetic and they'll help him, whether he's a slave or not. And that's why the Adon could keep him as a slave, doesn't have to set him free, because people will still give him charity, even if he's owned by somebody else, even if he's still a slave. And that's a matter of an interesting debate about what we assume people on the street do. Do they help people only if they're Jewish and only if they don't have a master who they think is responsible for that? Or will they help him in any case? Tashma, source number 4. Da'amarav. Now we're moving to an Emora. If you're the master and you sanctify whatever the proceeds are, you say whatever you make is going to be kodesh. Go to the temple. So now, what does this Eved do? What's the Eved going to survive on? Well, he borrows money. He eats from the borrowed money. He buys food with the borrowed money. Ochel, and then be'oseh, and then he works, and with the proceeds of what he works, he pays back the loan. Now, we're going to see later there's a problem. How could he use his proceeds? His proceeds are sanctified. Well, your proceeds only become sanctified if they're a shava pruta, they're worth a pruta. So what does he do? He makes a little bit. Before it gets to the value of a pruta, he already pays back his loan. He pays back his loan in pennies, basically. And then he slowly keeps paying back his loan very little by little. And that way it doesn't get sanctified and he can actually pay his loan. But every pruta he makes actually is sanctified because the owner has the right to sanctify his property and not feed him, basically. So here's again proof that the master can just say, your masei adayim are mine, and your food, you're on your own, because that's what he has to loan money. So they answer no. It must be where he was actually giving him food. So then, obviously, the Gemara is going to ask Hachi, and we're moving to Amud Bet now. If he's getting money to support himself, why does he need to borrow money to eat? Doesn't make any sense. It's for extra. He wants to eat extra. So now they say, hekdesh. Why does the hekdesh just say to him, we're not lending you money. We used to manage without the extra. So, and everyone else manages on the extra. We're not giving you rights to borrow money. Why should we do that? You can manage on the average $500 salary of a person. That's enough money, enough food for you to eat. So why do they allow him to borrow more than what the average person needs? Well, they say hekdesh gufa nichale. It's actually in the best interest of the hekdesh. They want the Eved to be strong, because the stronger the Eved is, the theory is, right? You eat more, you'll be able to work more. If you're able to work more, you'll be able to produce more. And instead of making the average $500, maybe you'll end up making $900, and therefore they give him the extra money. They let him borrow it so that it'll build up his body and he'll be stronger and be able to produce more. And remember, all his masei adayim go to hekdesh, so it's in the best interest of the hekdesh. So now they say, our question from before, oseu porea, how could he work and use the money to pay back his loan? Every cent, right? Every pruta he makes is going to go right to hekdesh. How can he possibly use it for himself? As I said before, it's that he makes less than a shava pruta. Every little bit he makes before it gets sanctified, it only gets sanctified when it's the word of a pruta. So he takes pennies basically and pays back his loan in pennies. Now we're going to further prove that this is talking about a case where actually the master is feeding him, and the only thing he's borrowing is for the extra. Hachinami, and that really the master can't say, I'm taking all your money and I'm taking all your proceeds and I'm not feeding you. Hachinami mistaber da amarav, in a different statement, Rav says something that seems contradictory. And the only way to resolve this, you'll see, is to say, well, one is where he gave him food and one is where he didn't. You'll see. Hamakdish yedei avdo, if you sanctify your proceeds of your slave, which a minute ago we just said it will be sanctified and he'll be stuck. Oto ha'ebed oseh ve'ochel. Actually, the slave is allowed to eat his maseh yadayim, in other words, keep his proceeds, use it to support himself. And it's not actually sanctified. Why? Because, now think about it. If you made this deal, take your proceeds and use it for your own sake, then the master actually has no rights to your proceeds, so he can't sanctify them. So his sanctification is meaningless. So, di'ilo avda, if you don't let him work and use his proceeds, man palachle, who's going to support this person? He'll be left on the street. He'll have no food. So, you can explain the cases. Okay, again, all these things are charted out, so you can see them on the sheet. I'm not sharing screen, but you can see it on the sheet, which is when he's makdish yedei avdo and the guy borrows, that's where he's giving him food. Okay, and then he's right. Then he basically borrows for the extra. Okay, but he gives him food. In the second case, it's where he's not giving him food. Now, if he doesn't give him food, then the master has no rights to the maseh yadayim. And that exactly proves, right, what we're trying to prove, which is you can't just say, give me your proceeds and I'm not feeding you. So then it makes perfect sense. If he's not giving him food, then actually the sanctification doesn't work because the owner has no rights to the proceeds. And then it works perfectly. But if you say it's where he didn't give him food and he's allowed to do that and still keep the proceeds, well, that means the owner can basically say you're on your own. And then why are we saying you're leaving the slave on his own? It seems you can leave the slave on his own. And the master, it's not the master's problem that you're leaving the slave on his own. He's allowed to do that. So that source makes no sense if you explain it that way. So it must be you can't make that kind of a deal with him. Okay, you can't say I keep your proceeds and you get nothing. So now, Tashma, last source. Here we get to now this last source. See, my internet's unstable. Sorry. Oh. Okay. Am I back? Do you hear me? Okay. Sorry. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, last source. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Again, we're into Emoraim, right? The first three were Tanaim. Now we're in Emoraim. That was Rav. Now we're moving ahead to Rabbi Yochanan. Hakotea yad avdo shel chavero. Okay, you cut off the hand of a slave of someone else by accident, whatever. You damaged someone else's slave. You have to pay. These are payments that you have to pay when you damage someone. So you have to pay the money they're not working, all the proceeds that they're not making. This is proceeds, right? And the doctor's bills to the owner. Now, not to the person, not to the slave. And this slave gets supported now because he can't work. He gets supported by charity. Shema binat sounds very clear. It sounds like, right, the master gets all the money from the proceeds, which is the shevet. There are no proceeds, but that's in place of proceeds. And he doesn't have to support him because the guy gets supported from charity. So this time they're going to try to say this isn't the case, but they're going to have no choice in the end but to say it is the case. So they're going to say again, it must be where he gave him food. How could you possibly say we could give him food? What does it say? What does it mean? He gets supported from charity. If the master's paying his money, his food, he's not getting supported from charity. So they say, just like we said before, it's the extra. What he wants some extra food. He gets that from charity. They say, no, you can't possibly say that. Nizon means you get your mizonot, your basic food needs. It should say mit parnes. The word lit parnes would be you're getting extra. It would include maybe something more. But nizon is basic, and therefore the language really doesn't match that. It should say mit parnes v'baile, and since it doesn't, elalav shmamina yachol shmamina. After this crazy long study where we tried really, right, all sorts of crazy things and explanations, which was what made this daf challenging. Every possible explanation to try to say a master cannot say, take your proceeds and you're on your own. In the end, we have no choice but to say he really can, based on this source. Now we're going to just understand the source a little better. Amar Mar, going off on a tangent now. Noten shivto rupuato l'rabo. Shivto pshita. Obviously, the master gets the maseh yadayim, right? The shevet is in place of the maseh yadayim. Refuato itzrichale. The reason why they said this, though, is to get to the refuah. The doctor's bills go to the master. Now, theoretically, this is a little strange. Where the doctor's bills go? To the doctor, not to the master. So, refuato didei. They say, theoretically, he should get it, right? It's for his own doctor bills. Debai itzriyebe, because he needs it for, right? Give it to the eved and let him pay the doctor. So they say what it means here is, lo tzricha da'amdu alacham shayome. They said you need to go to a doctor for a 5-day treatment. They gave him an extra strong medication, which we're going to see kind of made it was difficult for him to get this extra strong medication, like a stronger medication that works in 3 days is going to be more painful for your body, but it'll be a quicker and cheaper method. Okay. So they ended up giving him that's what happened. The court said you need a 5-day treatment. They gave him the money for 5 days, but in the end, he only needed 3 days worth of money. So who gets the extra money? Right? He was cured in 3 days. Maybe you would think the slave will get it because he went through the torturous treatment that was much more painful for his body. Maybe he should get the extra 2 days because it's interesting. The 2 days doesn't go back ever. In a regular case, forget about a slave. Doesn't go back to the original person. You say, oh, I didn't use the doctor's bills. Here, you get it back. Whatever they assessed your doctor's bills are, that's what you get. And, right, so kamash malan, no, it goes to the master because, again, whatever the eved has, right, it goes to the master. Okay, Tanya. Now we get off on back to the Mishnah where we had this discussion between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. We're only going to start this today. We don't have a lot of time, and I'm going to stop a little bit before the end of the daf because it says a lot of things that are very confusing that we're really only going to figure out tomorrow or at the end of today's daf. We're going to start, but I think we'll skip that for today. We'll do it tomorrow, just trying to really understand what's going on in this source. So now we quote a source, which is in the Tosefta. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amarnu lo lemeir. He was friends with Rabbi Meir, so he calls him Meir without calling him Rabbi Meir. Isn't it good for the Eved to be free? And that's why, right, you shouldn't be allowed to change your mind. Once the Shaliach gets the document, it's as if the Eved's free. Amar lo chofu lo. He says, no, it's a chof. Shemaya Eved Kohen puslom and truma. That's like what we said in the Mishnah. If he was a Kohen, his master, he would disqualify him from eating truma by getting that document, which means it's not good for him. Amarnu lo. So we said to him, the rabbis, if he wants to not support him and not feed him, he could. In which case, it's better for him to be free. Amar lanu uma ilu eved kohen shebarach ve'eshet kohen shemarda bala halo ochlim et truma v'zeh eino ochel. If they ran away and didn't get the get or didn't get the emancipation document, they would still be allowed to eat truma. So for the woman, it's a chov. It's not good for her because it disqualifies her from truma and it prevents her from eating the food. And for the slave, it just disqualifies him from truma. So now we don't really understand this yet. And the Gemara is going to say, what were the rabbis saying in the sentence before this? And what was Rabbi Meir answering? They don't really understand what's going on, and they're going to explain it, and we'll leave that for tomorrow. That's it for today. So quick review. It's kind of late, and it was a long, complicated daf, so we're going to stop here. But quick review of the daf. We started with, we thought Topes the Baal Chov was the same machloket as by the poor person, and then we gave 2 reasons why this isn't really the same machloket. Then the main thing we did today was really go through these 5 sources in an attempt each time to say, it seems like, and we're going to try to reject this, it seems like a master can say to his Eved, give me all your proceeds and you're on the street, you got to find your own sustenance somehow. Each time we rejected it and said, no, it must be where he said, take, right, you keep your proceeds and with that feed yourself, and I just won't give you the extra or something like that. But the last source really did seem to prove what we were trying so hard not to, which is a master really can say to his slave, I get your proceeds and you're on your own for your food. Okay, as difficult and troubling as that is, that's the conclusion of the Gemara. Okay, and with that, we'll end here. And like I said, we'll pick up from where we ended today and we'll understand this source a lot better once the Gemara explains it. Wishing everyone a great week and a great day.